So our next step is to take out the actual takedown pin. That's located at the front of the lower. Now in this particular case, what we're going to do is use a small flat-bladed screwdriver, and we're going to remove the tension on this actual detent inside here, and then take the spring out. Now the way to do this is first to just push the pin out just enough so that you can see again this detent that's pushing against the actual takedown pin, and we just put enough pressure on here to push this back. Once we've done that, we just rotate this so that now you can see this channel is pointing upward, and we've removed the internal pressure on the actual detent pin itself. Okay, so our next step, now that we've got the actual takedown pin moved up and we still have the pressure on it, there's a lot of people that show you how to kind of do this and make sure you retain that little detent in the spring. My suggestion is to just do it simply. Just take a large storage bag and simply take the lower, insert it inside the storage bag itself, like so, and then just remove the pin, and the spring and the detent will actually pop out. You can see it right there. It will actually pop out, and then that's when you can collect the parts. Our next step is to remove the grip, which will also remove the safety selector, spring, and detent. So the first thing you're going to need to do is either use a 3/16 inch nut driver or a screwdriver, depending upon the type of connector you have inside the grip. But what you'll have to do is look inside the grip itself, find out what type of connection that you have in here. In this particular case, we have a hex nut, and then use the appropriate tool to get in there and remove that. So what we'll do is we'll just simply take, in our case, our hex nut, and then just loosen it up. Again, let's take a look up here. Just remember, you just want to loosen up just enough. Don't take it all the way out yet, and you'll see why in just a moment. And if you look down to your actual part where the grip intersects with the receiver, you'll start to see it come loose, and you'll start to see the spring, which is actually holding the safety selector detent pin in, and that's what allows the safety selector to move back and forth and snap into place. So let's adjust the camera so you can see that more closely. Okay, I've flipped this around so you can see this a little bit more clearly. This is actually the side where you'll find the spring and the detent pin that's holding that safety selector. So as we loosen this up, what you're going to find is that you might actually see your grip pop just like that. And you can see down there, as we're loosening this up now, you can see that spring as it's applying pressure back onto the grip. So again, what you want to do is be real careful as you're removing the bolt itself so that the spring does not pop out. In this particular case though, you do want to be careful as you remove the grip. Just watch out for that spring right there. Just take that spring, there you go, and then just put that with the rest of your parts, as well as the grip retention bolt. At this point in time, you can also probably remove your safety selector by just manipulating that just a little bit side to side and then pulling it out. One thing you'll notice right here is that the safety selector detent has popped up a little bit. It's just now sticking out of there. And then our next step is to just take the receiver out of whatever mount it is that you're using, and then carefully turn it over and nudge that safety selector detent pin out, and then put that with the rest of your parts. Let's review the parts that you have taken off the receiver by now. You've removed the receiver extension and the stock, as well as the grip. Those are not pictured in here. But we also have the buffer retainer and the buffer retainer spring. We have the takedown pin. Now remember that the takedown pin is shorter than the pivot pin, but the pivot pin spring and the takedown pin spring are the same size, as well as the detents. So the takedown pin detent is the same size as the pivot pin detent. We also have the safety selector detent spring and safety selector detent. The safety selector detent is different from the other two detent pins. You can tell because it has a flat end on one side. We have the safety selector, and then we also have the grip machine screw and the grip machine lock washer. So these are the small parts that you should have set aside right now. If you're missing any of these, please look around. These are very important as you're trying to reassemble this. Our next step now is to remove the hammer and the trigger assembly. We're going to do that by removing the hammer pin and the trigger pin. To do this, you should have about a 4mm punch, as well as a hammer that has a non-marring surface to it. You'll also, before you start to drive these pins out, probably want to take like a piece of masking tape, something to that effect, and just cover up the side of the receiver where you're going to be removing these pins. And the benefit here is that we can protect the side of our receiver as we're driving these pins out with our punch. Now all we need to do is to remove the hammer pin first. We're going to drive the hammer pin all the way out. Simply line the punch up with the actual pin itself and then tap it out. You do not need to hammer really hard in order to drive the pin out. It's basically held there under spring pressure. So you can just push it out. Very simple. Alright, we're going to take this pin out and then move over to the trigger pin assembly. One thing we want to keep in mind when we're removing the hammer itself is that it is under spring pressure. So we just want to kind of push down a little bit on this hammer spring so that we're applying the pressure back, take the actual punch out, and then allow the hammer and the spring to come up very carefully, just like this. Now again, set this with the rest of your parts. Now our next step is to take out the trigger pin, and we drive that out the same way that we drove out the hammer pin. Again, once this is done, the trigger itself is under spring tension as well. So we'll pull the punch out and then allow the trigger to gently come out. And remember that you have a sear connector as well that's attached to the trigger assembly. You might have a one-piece trigger assembly, so it makes it a lot easier, but just remember to hold these pieces in place. There's also a very small spring that you can just see inside there, and you want to make sure that that doesn't fall out. So try to keep the whole trigger assembly together like this. Again, we're not trying to replace this part right now, we're just talking about the disassembly of the receiver. And what we've done is that we pretty much have a naked receiver now. We've removed all of the key components that people are likely to replace. The thing that we have still left in place is the magazine disconnect, and we're not going to go into that for this video. But we just wanted to cover the basics of stripping the receiver from a fully assembled lower down to the basic receiver, and there you are now. You have a completely stripped receiver.